Greetings and welcome to the fourth episode of our series on World War I. This episode delves into the crucial events that occurred in 1917, a year that saw major changes in the direction of the war. We'll discuss how the United States entered the conflict, giving the worn-out Allies new resources and hope. We'll also look at the historic Russian Revolution, which resulted in Russia's withdrawal from the war and a significant shift in world affairs. We'll discuss significant engagements and tactical decisions that influenced the war's second half. On the 1st of February 1917, Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare. Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare in 1917 because it believed it was the only way to break the British blockade and force Britain to surrender. The Allied blockade had caused severe shortages of food and supplies in Germany, leading to a critical situation. German leaders, particularly Admiral von Hotzendorf, argued that unrestricted submarine attacks on all ships, including neutral ones, could cripple Britain by cutting off its essential supplies. Germany understood that this strategy risked bringing the United States into the war, but they calculated that they could starve Britain into submission before American forces could make a significant impact. 2 days after the Germans resumed submarine warfare, the United States broke diplomatic relations with Germany, and just hours after that, the American ship Housatonic was sunk by a German U-boat. The new U-boat blockade nearly succeeded, and between February and April 1917, U-boats sank more than 500 merchant ships. In the second half of April, an average of 13 ships were sunk each day. In November 1916, Admiral Jellicoe created an Admiralty anti-submarine division, but effective countermeasures arrived slowly. Most important was the introduction of convoys, in which merchant ships were grouped together and protected by warships. In addition, merchant ships were painted in dazzle camouflage. Aircraft and shore-based direction-finding stations were introduced to locate U-boats, and warships acquired new weapons such as an early form of sonar and depth charges. Fast forward, on the 1st of March 1917, the British presented the United States with a telegram Germany made to Mexico. On the 19th of January, British intelligence had intercepted a secret message from German Foreign Minister Arthur Zimmermann to the Mexican government. He proposed that Mexico ally with Germany against the United States. He promised them the territories of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona, states Mexico lost to the US during the Mexican War of 1846-47. The British took their time, however, before revealing the telegram to the United States. They carefully managed the release of the information to avoid compromising their intelligence operations, and it wasn't until late February 1917 that they shared it with the US officials. After verifying its authenticity and carefully considering the timing, US President Woodrow Wilson decided to release the telegram to the public on the 1st of March. The telegram galvanized American public opinion against Germany once and for all. The telegram was considered perhaps Britain's greatest intelligence coup of World War I. What led to the proposal of an alliance with Mexico? Zimmermann sent the telegram in anticipation of resuming unrestricted submarine warfare, an act the German government expected would likely lead to war with the US. The telegram was a calculated move to mitigate the impact of US involvement by stirring up trouble on America's southern border. Zimmermann hoped tensions with Mexico would slow shipments of supplies, munitions, and troops to the Allies if the US was tied down. Some suspected the telegram might be a forgery to manipulate America into the war. However, on the 29th of March 1917, Zimmermann gave a speech in the Reichstag confirming the text of the telegram and so put an end to all speculation as to its authenticity. The secret to the British interception began years earlier. In 1914, with war imminent, the British had quickly dispatched a ship to cut Germany's 5 transatlantic cables and 6 underwater cables running between Britain and Germany. Soon after the war began, the British successfully tapped into overseas cable lines Germany borrowed from neutral countries to send communications. Britain began capturing large volumes of intelligence communications. British code breakers worked to decrypt communication codes, complex systems of encrypted messages used to protect military and diplomatic communications from being intercepted and understood by the enemy. In October of 1914, the Russian Admiralty gave British naval intelligence, known as Room 40, a copy of the German naval code book removed from a drowned German sailor's body from the cruiser SMS Magdeburg. Room 40 also received a copy of the German diplomatic code, stolen from a German diplomat's luggage in the Near East. By 1917, British intelligence, an office of cryptographers, mathematicians, and language experts who specialized in cracking German codes, could decipher most German messages. After navigating the Zimmermann telegram, we reached the Russian Revolution. In 1917, two revolutions swept through Russia, causing a profound change on the Eastern Front. Both the future of international politics and the path of World War I were significantly changed by this turbulent time. For 300 years, Russia had been ruled by a royal family, the Romanovs. The Romanovs had been an incredibly powerful family, ruling 1/6 of the world's surface. But the ruler at the time, Tsar Nicholas II, was seen by many as a poor leader. At the time of the revolution, Russia was an autocracy, with Tsar Nicholas II holding absolute power over his people. Government corruption was rampant. The Russian economy remained backward in comparison to other countries in Europe. Food shortages and military failures at the start of the 20th century had caused strikes and riots that were often brutally suppressed. The 1905 revolution had led to some reforms, including the establishment of a state Duma, legislative assembly, that is. A legislative assembly is a formal group of elected representatives who have the authority to create, amend, and pass laws. Despite these changes, there was still no real democracy in Russia. Nicholas repeatedly dissolved the Duma when it opposed his will. Russia entered World War I in August 1914 in support of the Serbs and their French and British allies. Their involvement in the war would soon prove disastrous for the Russian Empire, though. Russia's entry into the First World War was initially supported by most Russians. However, its infrastructure struggled to cope with the demands of war. Russia's industry depended almost entirely on foreign imports. When Germany and its Turkish allies blockaded Russia's eastern ports, its railway, electricity, and supply systems broke down. There were not enough labourers to collect the harvest, and there were serious food shortages. To make matters worse, militarily, Imperial Russia was no match for industrialized Germany, and Russian casualties were greater than those sustained by any nation in any previous war. The war was going terribly for Russia, with a string of defeats. In 1915, the Tsar attempted to boost morale by taking personal command of the army. This move had disastrous results. The Tsar was a poor military leader, and he was now being blamed for every defeat. He had also left his wife, the German-born Tsarina Alexandra, in charge at home. The Tsarina's brusque demeanor and distaste for Russian culture made her unpopular with the Russian populace. The Russians were convinced she was a German spy. During this time, her controversial advisor, Grigory Rasputin, increased his influence over Russian politics and the royal Romanov family. With little food, no ammunition, or even proper uniforms, Russian soldiers began to mutiny in their thousands. Strikes and protests in Russia saw no reforms from the government. Trade unions were banned and troublemakers were sent into exile. By early 1917, most Russians had completely lost faith in the Tsarist regime. On the 7th of March 1917, metal workers in Petrograd, formerly St. Petersburg, went on strike. They were joined the next day, International Women's Day, by female protesters marching against food rationing. Crowds attacked bakeries in a desperate search for bread. Most protesters and strikers took part, and around 200,000 filled the streets of the city, demanding the replacement of the Tsar and an end to the war. Eventually, nearly all industry in Petrograd was shut down. The Tsar ordered the commander of the Petrograd garrison, General Khalov, to suppress the rioting by force. But troops in the city refused. They mutinied and joined the protesters. When informed of these events, Nicholas II dismissed it as a hooligan movement, which would soon be over. Even as his regime met total collapse, the Tsar still showed his inability to face reality. Having lost the support of the army under the advice of his military chiefs and ministers, the Tsar abdicated for himself and his son on the 15th of March, 1917. The Tsar's son, Alexei, couldn't succeed the throne due to his severe hemophilia, which made him far too fragile to rule. His brother refused to succeed the throne because he recognized the deep unpopularity of the monarchy and the political instability in Russia. This refusal marked the end of the Tsarist regime and concluded 300 years of Romanov rule in Russia. Immediately following the revolution, a new government was formed, called the Provisional Government. This was a self-appointed cabinet made up of members of the Duma and led by the politician and landowner Prince George Lvov. The new government had no constitutional authority, meaning it wasn't established or sanctioned by a formal legal framework, giving it no official legitimacy. The provisional government was seen to still overwhelmingly represent the interests of the privileged and wealthy. Its members were largely aristocrats, landowners, or professionals. Its position was also weakened because of dual power. It had to share power with another body, the Petrograd Soviet of Workers and Soldiers and Deputies. This was an assembly of over 500 which had been elected by ordinary people and so was seen as more representative. Despite introducing a program of liberal reforms over the following months, the provisional government decided not to take Russia out of the war. They failed to address one of the main causes for the February Revolution, and this would be one of the factors that led to a second revolution in November 1917. In late March, Germany sank 4 more US merchant ships. Coupled with American outrage over Germany's resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare and the Zimmermann telegram, these events were the tipping point that persuaded the United States to join the war. On the 2nd of April, President Wilson appeared before Congress and called for a declaration of war against Germany, famously stating that the world must be made safe for democracy. On the 4th of April, the Senate voted to declare war against Germany, and 2 days later, the House of Representatives endorsed the declaration. With that, America entered World War I. When Wilson went before Congress on the 2nd of April to deliver his war message, the president had pledged all his nation's considerable material resources to help the Allies defeat the Central Powers. What the Allies desperately needed, however, were fresh troops to relieve their exhausted men on the battlefields of the Western Front, and these the United States was not immediately able to provide. America practically had no army. Despite Wilson's effort to improve military preparedness over the course of 1916, at the time of Congress's war declaration, the United States had only a small army of volunteers, some 100,000 men, that was in no way trained or equipped for the kind of fighting that was going on in Europe. The only real soldiers they had were 15,000 Marines. To resolve this situation, Wilson pushed the government to adopt military conscription, which he argued was the most democratic form of enlistment. To that end, Congress passed the Selective Service Act, which Wilson signed into law on the 18th of May, 1917. The act required all men in the United States between the ages of 21 and 30 to register for military service. The authorities of the United States expected 1 million men to volunteer, but 6 weeks in, only 80,000 have signed up. For Americans, the war was far away. They were still haunted by the butchery of the Civil War, which ended just 50 years earlier. The Americans followed the lead of the British and issued a recruiting poster featuring Uncle Sam reading, "I want you." Within a few months, however, some 10 million men across the country had registered in response to the military draft. The first troops of the American Expeditionary Force, AEF, under Commander-in-Chief General John J. Pershing, began arriving in France in late June 1917 to begin training for combat. The Americans' training was considered substandard by British and French instructors who brought in to raise their combat skills. The Americans' recruits' training was rudimentary in comparison to their European allies. There was nothing ready except the drill sergeant. They trained with dummy wood rifles, dummy cannons, due to severe shortages of real firearms and supplies. On the other hand, the troops were often good street fighters, a skill they have learned in a country whose evolution was marked by bloodshed. Still, it would take time to turn Americans into real soldiers. The first Americans entered combat 4 months later, on the 21st of October. The AEF did not begin to play a substantial role in the fighting in France until nearly a year later, during the late spring and summer of 1918. In the interim, the United States gave its allies much-needed help in the form of economic assistance, extending vast amounts of credit to Britain, France, and Italy. However, Americans still couldn't meet the need of its troops. They were short of equipment. They had to buy from France 2,500 cannons, 11 million artillery shells, 50,000 machine guns, 200 million bullets, 4,500 airplanes, and above all, 235 Renault FTs, the revolutionary new tank, the first armoured vehicle with a rotating turret crucial to the war of movement Pershing wants to wage. To finance this staggering purchase, the United States raised income taxes to generate more revenue for the war effort. The government also raised money by launching a massive bond issue, Liberty Bonds. Liberty Bonds were sold to American citizens to finance the purchases of the products and raw materials from the Allies. Through the Liberty Bonds program, citizens essentially lent money to the government to assist in covering the expenses of military operations during times of conflict. After a certain number of years, those who invested in these bonds would receive their money back plus interest. By the end of the war, the government's debt was more than $25 billion. After more than 3 years of stalemate along the Western Front, America's entry into the conflict was a major turning point in the war despite their late entry and initial war preparation struggles. By the third year of the First World War, France was growing increasingly war-weary. Over 1 million men had been killed, wounded, or captured with little to show for it. Russia had had a revolution and unrest was spreading through the French army, fanned by turmoil at home, lack of leave, and German propaganda. Their failure of the Nivelle offensive was the last straw and led to what has become known as the mutiny of the French army. The French had borne the brunt of the fighting on the Western Front while Britain's new armies were created. By 1917, there was a growing feeling among French troops that their generals, the blood drinkers, had little regard for their lives, which they were throwing away uselessly. French soldiers returning to the front from leave brought back stories of food shortages, strikes, and protests at home. Leave itself was a long-standing source of contention among the troops. When they actually got leave, much of it was wasted travelling home and left them very little time with their families. The troops were giving anti-war leaflets while in transit by a growing number of far-left activists. The Germans were also engaged in a conspiracy to buy French newspapers to print anti-war propaganda and undermine France's will to fight. Nonetheless, there was still a fighting spirit among the troops, and Nivelle, the new commander-in-chief, managed to reinstall some optimism with his coming offensive, which he said would bring victory. The offensive began on the 16th of April 1917 and ended on the 9th of May 1917. The offensive was a costly failure with over 130 casualties. The last hope went, and by June, much of the army was in a state of mutiny. The early stages of the mutiny were largely drunken disturbances. Soldiers who thought of themselves as French citizens first and soldiers second began to protest at the pointlessness of continuing the offensive. The actual term mutiny for these protests is still controversial. They could perhaps be best described as strikes for better treatment. The French authorities described them as, quote, collective disobedience, end quote. They fluctuated in size and scale, increasing in seriousness through May and June 1917, and ranged from protests and riots to refusal to attack and attempts to march on Paris and install a new government. These disturbances were, however, confined to the rest areas. The troops at the front continued to hold the line. David Murphy, in Breaking Point of the French Army, the Nivelle Offensive of 1917, states that the mutinies had 4 phases. The first began as early as the start of the Nivelle Offensive. These were generally small protests and a refusal to obey orders. By mid-May, the protests began to spread and increase in magnitude, with entire divisions taking part in increasingly violent and desperate collective disobedience. The first week of June marked an escalation in the level of violence, and it was evident the French army was barely able to function as a fighting force, with 54 divisions taking part in the protests. Discipline began to be restored by the end of June. Pétain, who had replaced Nivelle, regained control. The military tribunals had put 3,500 mutineers on trial. 1,380 had been sent to long prison terms, 600 had been condemned to death, 57 had been executed. Pétain shot the ringleaders, but introduced reforms that improved the conditions of the troops. He also never launched another full-scale offensive. In June 1917, thousands of soldiers go on leave on orders from Pétain, as if he had agreed to one of the demands of the mutineers. In fact, he is only applying the law. Ignored until then, the grants troops 7 days rest every 4 months. Thousands of men suddenly went home. Like Private Gaston Lavie, already in his 40s, he fought at the Battle of Verdun. Back home in Paris, he is bitter. He says, quote, "No one cares about us. We are being sacrificed. The poor fools at the front. We feel forgotten, unwanted, out of place, as if we don't belong. The war enriches the profiteers. Away from the front, the good life goes on." End quote. The great unknown about the mutinies is why the Germans didn't exploit them. German intelligence did receive reports of disorder in the French lines, but they didn't act on them. David Murphy suggests that it could have been that the Germans weren't able to launch an offensive, or the reports simply weren't believed. The French were also able to keep the full extent of the mutinies a secret, even from their allies. By the time the Second Battle of Ypres ended, strategic high ground had been lost, and the Salient was narrowed. Thus, after 2 years, on the 31st of July 1917, the British and French launched an offensive in the area around Ypres in the Belgian province of Flanders to retake the high ground and break out of the salient. The battle is referred to as the Third Battle of Ypres, known in later years as Passchendaele. This battle was not as bloody as the Somme the year before, but would achieve its own notoriety. The German U-boats were starving the English and killing countless victims. Fearful for his citizens, King George V demands that the Germans be stopped at all cost. His solution was to seize the Kaiser's submarine bases that occupied Belgium at Ostend and Bruges. In 1917, British positions in Belgium were based around the city of Ypres, where they had been since the beginning of the First World War. They occupied the salient, a bulge in the lines of trenches. Strategically important, the Ypres salient blocked any German advance to the English Channel. It was fought over ferociously during the First Battle of Ypres in 1914, and again the following year during the Second Battle of Ypres. Passchendaele would be the third and largest major battle in the area in 3 years. Ypres is probably the most dangerous area for the British soldiers on the entire Western Front. Surrounded by Germans on 3 sides and overlooked by high ground, it was very vulnerable to German fire, and British Prime Minister David Lloyd George was aware of this. The Prime Minister was not keen on the offensive in this strategically difficult sector in Flanders where German defences are stronger than anywhere along the front. George was appalled that 200,000 British Empire soldiers have already been sacrificed. He expressed anxiety over whether so great an operation would cause heavy casualties, which would be difficult to replace given the present state of manpower. British Commander-in-Chief Sir Douglas Haig, who led the offensive, replied that he thought there was no grounds for such fears. George wanted to wait for the Americans to enter the action, but he failed to convince his military leaders. While the first and second battles of Ypres were attacks by the Germans against the Allies, the third was spearheaded by the British. The British had wanted to attack in the Flanders area in 1916, but had conceded to French desires to launch a joint assault on the Somme. A year later, in 1917, after the Arras offensive, which had brought such early success for the British, the resounding failure of the Nivelle offensive the previous May, followed by widespread mutinies within the French army, Haig insisted that the British should press ahead with another major offensive that summer. He planned to launch a major attack in the Ypres salient and force the breakthrough that he believed would win the war. In his opinion, the war could, quote, only be won in Flanders, end quote. I thought I'd mention that Haig's army had also gone through a crisis. 306 British soldiers from the trenches had been executed for refusing to fight. He planned to capture the high ground around Ypres, Passchendaele Ridge, as well as a key rail junction to the east, and then advance on the German-occupied ports of the Belgian coast and destroy German submarine bases, critical to the U-boat campaign. British Admiral Jellicoe warned that the British could not keep up the war into 1918 if they kept losing ships. The aggressive and meticulously planned offensive was driven by Haig's mistaken belief that the German army was on the verge of collapse and would be broken completely by a major Allied victory. It was an ambitious and risky plan, but it did not learn the lessons from the Somme the previous year, or take into account the army's strained resources after the Arras offensive earlier in 1917. After a preliminary artillery bombardment of 2 weeks, which saw 3,000 guns fire 4 million shells at German positions, 4 times more than in the Battle of the Somme, the Great Offensive began at 3:50 a.m. on the 31st of July, 1917. Despite heavy enemy fire, the Allied advance was spectacular. On the first day at Pilkem Ridge, the British, and particularly the French allies, were able to make some gains, but not without cost. During the afternoon of the 31st of July, it began to rain heavily. British artillery observers lost sight of the advancing troops and were unable to support them as the German counterattacked. This resulted in the loss of captured ground. The rain continued and quickly turned the landscape, already smashed by 3 years of fighting, into an apocalyptic expanse, a swampy quagmire dotted with water-filled craters deep enough to drown a man, all made worse by the churned-up graves of soldiers killed in earlier fighting. Edwin Vaughan, a British soldier and writer, described the harrowing scene he experienced during the Third Battle of Ypres that reflects the extreme conditions faced by soldiers. The wounded crawl into the craters for protection. The rain continues and the water rises in the holes. Unable to move, the wounded drown. An officer weeps next to me. My men are in shock. I have to climb over bodies. A hand rises and grasps onto me. Horrified, pull out a living man from a pile of corpses. While rain was not unusual for the region, the volume and persistence of the rainfall were exceptional. It affected the British and French as they tried to advance across heavily contested ground more than German defenders. In particular, the rain made supplying the guns and moving them forward virtually impossible. After the opening day, both sides made efforts to strengthen their positions, but by the 2nd of August, the rain had made any kind of strategic movement all but impossible. As a result, the whole Passchendaele offensive was postponed for several days. Renewed effort was made in a new battle. At Langemarck, on the 16th to the 18th of August 1917, the French once again made substantial gains and the British were also able to take some ground, but German counterattacks forced them back. Rain once again hindered any attempts at attack, and morale among the German defenders remained higher than the British generals expected. Telephone lines had been cut. Only carrier pigeons can get through the hell of gunfire. They deliver the dreadful news to Haig, who downplays the extent of the disaster in reports to the government. The Battle of Menin Road, which began on the 20th and lasted to the 25th of September 1917, witnessed the first use of General Herbert Plumer's fight and hold strategy as the British tried to regain the initiative, with the British Army's early attempts to break through on a wide front having been halted by the deep German defence system. Plumer instead selected for attack a small part of the German front line. This would be heavily shelled and then assaulted in strength. The advancing troops would stop once they had penetrated 1,500 yards into the German lines. At this point they would dig in, and another wave of attacking troops would pass through them to attack the next objective. The original attackers would then consolidate the ground they had taken and become the new reserve for future advances. Using this tactic became possible when more artillery was deployed, thanks partly to the ground drying out between late August and September. It meant that British soldiers did not move beyond where they could be supported. In addition, they were aided by more and better aircraft carrying out air defence, artillery observation, and ground attack sorties. This meant that when the German counterattack was launched, instead of finding a mass of exhausted and disorganised men at the limit of the Allied advance, they would find a well-organised defensive line still in range of supporting artillery. In this phase of the battle, tanks were deployed, just as they had been along the Somme a year earlier, but in far greater numbers. The tanks became stuck in the mud and were easy prey for the German 77 field guns. The Germans stripped the disabled tanks and salvaged whatever they could. Because of the Allied blockade, Germany ran out of steel to manufacture tanks. Despite the tanks' inability to navigate the challenging terrain effectively, the Menin Road operation was a success. Most of Plumer's objectives were captured on the first day. German counterattacks were repulsed on the first and second days of the operation. 3 quiet days then followed. The battle ended with a final German counterattack on the 25th of September, again repulsed without serious problems. The Allied forces made 2 further successful attacks in September and October at Polygon Wood and Broodseinde, and drove the Germans back to the top of the Passchendaele Ridge. The army at Passchendaele was the largest Britain had ever fielded, but it wasn't only made up of British soldiers. Men from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Southern Rhodesia, India, Newfoundland, and the Caribbean all served along British units and shared in the hardships of the battle. Australian soldiers were used from September to try and regain the momentum, making the most of better weather to help carry the advance. But the weather turned again and they too struggled. There would be 38,000 casualties among Australian units fighting in the Passchendaele offensive. In mid-October, with the battle bogging down due to British and Australian exhaustion, the stubborn German defence and the bad weather, Haig sent for the Canadians to make a final push and try to salvage a victory. Despite the objections of General Sir Arthur Currie, commander of the Canadian Corps, the Canadians were committed to battle on the 26th of October. Passchendaele Ridge was finally captured on the 10th of November, the town that had been intended to be captured within a few hours on the first day of the offensive. Currie estimated that throwing the Canadians into battle at Passchendaele would result in 16,000 casualties. He was eerily accurate. 15,654 Canadians were killed or wounded. The heavy casualties and appalling conditions suffered during the advance on Passchendaele perhaps contributed to the use of the name to refer to the battle. The eventual capture of Passchendaele Ridge on the 10th of November 1917 allowed Haig to finally call off the offensive, claiming victory, despite heavy casualties and the failure to create any substantial breakthrough or change of momentum on the Western Front. The Allies suffered over 250,000 casualties, soldiers killed, wounded or missing, during the Third Battle of Ypres. Casualties among German forces were also in the region of 200,000. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission commemorates over 76,000 soldiers who died during the Battle of Ypres. More than half have no known grave. The German army could not afford the losses it incurred at Ypres. While the Allies would soon be reinforced by the Americans, Germany could not replace that manpower. Given its outcome, the Third Battle of Ypres remains one of the most costly and controversial offensives of World War I. The British had taken the high ground around Ypres and advanced 5 miles, but was the return worth it? Could or should the battle have been called off earlier rather than fighting on in such atrocious conditions? The battle has been argued about ever since 1917. How much was achieved and at what cost? Was it a victory or a defeat? Prime Minister Lloyd George reflected on the battle in 1938, saying, quote, Passchendaele was indeed one of the greatest disasters of the war. No soldier of any intelligence now defends this senseless campaign, end quote. Haig was unrepentant after Passchendaele and considered it a success. He wrote in his report after the battle, quote, the ultimate destruction of the enemy's field forces has been brought appreciably nearer, end quote. But simply eroding German strength wasn't what he had set out to do at the beginning of the battle. He wanted a breakthrough. In 1918, to better organize their defense in the face of a German offensive, the British abandoned their positions on the Passchendaele Ridge without firing a shot. What had taken months and cost thousands of lives was surrendered meekly. Today, Passchendaele remains a vivid symbol of the hardship of fighting on the Western Front, and for the British, epitomizes the wasteful and futile nature of trench warfare. On the 6th and 7th of November 1917, or October 24th and 25th on the Julian calendar, which is why the event is often referred to as the October Revolution, Vladimir Lenin launched a nearly bloodless coup d'etat, a sudden and decisive action to overthrow the existing government against the Duma's provisional government. Italy had been defeated by the Austrians in the Battle of Caporetto. Worried that the Italians might withdraw from the war, the Allies decided to send reinforcements to the Italian front on the 15th of November 1917. 100,000 French and British troops were assigned to stop the German and Austrian advance towards Venice. They stopped the Austrian advance. The Austrian soldiers were tired of war. There were rumblings of mutiny and independence. The Austrian Emperor Karl I meets with Kaiser Wilhelm II. They travel to the front to appraise the situation. The emperor is increasingly worried that the revolt will spread. He favoured peace and wanted to negotiate, but not the Kaiser. He still dreamt of a victory that could save him. The Kaiser said, quote, after the war, we will conclude a major treaty with France and then with all of Europe. That done, I will lead the real war against England, end quote. The Kaiser and his generals believed they must achieve victory before the Americans were fully operational. The first step was to get Russia out of the war, so German armies could be redeployed from the eastern to the western front. To that end, they sought to destabilize the provisional government. General Ludendorff, still in Germany, facilitates the return of Russia's leading political agitator to Petrograd, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, known as Lenin. He led a group of revolutionaries called the Bolsheviks. The term Bolshevik comes from the Russian word Bolshtinstvo, meaning majority. The Bolsheviks were a faction of the Russian socialist movement. They emerged from a split in the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party in 1903 when the party divided into two groups, the Bolsheviks, or majoritarians, and the Mensheviks, or minoritarians. The Bolsheviks wanted to bring a new political system called communism to Russia. Until this point, communism had never been tried before. Communism is a political and economic system where all property and resources are owned by the community or the government rather than by individuals. The idea is that everyone shares wealth and resources equally, so there are no rich or poor people. In a communist society, the government usually controls industries, businesses, and how goods are distributed with the goal of creating equality for everyone. Lenin has been living in exile in Switzerland. The Germans arranged for Vladimir Lenin and his lieutenants to cross Germany en route from Switzerland to Russia in a secret sealed train after a decade of exile. He arrived on the 16th of April 1917. The Germans cunningly decided to finance both Lenin's party and this journey because the communists who opposed the Tsar in 1917 are still fighting the war. This unnatural alliance is not because Ludendorff supports Lenin's plan to ban private property, no, but because Lenin claims he will take Russia out of the war. Ludendorff said, quote, "Lenin will overthrow Russian patriots, and then I will strangle him and all his friends," end quote. In a Russia crushed by war, a Russia in misery, crushed by famine and with an army in chaos, Lenin promised, quote, "peace, bread, land, and freedom," end quote, for the masses. Lenin accused Alexander Kerensky, new leader of the provisional government, of prolonging the war. Lenin called for the overthrow of the provisional government and a Soviet government, a government that would be ruled directly by councils of soldiers, peasants, and workers, instead of a government led by a group of leaders from Russia's bourgeois capitalist class. In July, he was forced to flee to Finland, but his call for peace, land, and bread met with increasing popular support, and the Bolsheviks won a majority in the Petrograd Soviet. In October, Lenin secretly returned to Petrograd, and on the 6th to the 7th of November, Lenin and his followers deposed the provisional government and soon formed a new government with Lenin as its head. Lenin became the dictator of the world's first communist state. When the Bolsheviks seized power in Russia during the October Revolution, in November by the Western calendar, the country was still engaged in the First World War. The Russian army was disintegrating and the Germans had pushed far into the country and now occupied Russian Poland and Lithuania. An urgent priority for the new regime was to get out of the war. Thus, immediately after their accession to power, Lenin had approached the Central Powers to arrange an armistice and withdraw from a war they saw as the major obstacle to their plan of providing food and land to the long impoverished Russian peasant population. Leon Trotsky, in charge of foreign affairs, pressed Britain and France to open peace negotiations, threatening to make a separate armistice if his demands went unmet. After no response from the Allies, the Bolsheviks went ahead with their plan and made an appeal for peace that was welcomed by both Germany and Austria. On the 15th of December 1917, Russia and the Central Powers signed an armistice effective 17th of December and set to expire on the 15th of January 1918. Determining the terms of peace, however, between Russia and the Central Powers proved to be far more complicated. Negotiations began at the German headquarters in Brest-Litovsk in Poland, what is now Belarus, on the 22nd of December. Leading their respective delegations were foreign ministers Leon Trotsky of Russia, Richard von Kuhlmann of Germany, Count Oskar Czernin of Austria, and Talat Pasha of the Ottoman Empire. Trotsky tried to delay the signing of a formal peace treaty, hoping that revolutions would break out in Germany and other Central Powers, which could shift the balance in Russia's favor. He was unsuccessful. No such thing occurred. In mid-February, the talks broke down when an angry Trotsky deemed the Central Powers' terms too harsh and their demands for territory unacceptable. To the stupefaction of the Central Powers delegates, Trotsky announced, quote, "neither war nor peace," end quote, meaning that Russia would not resume fighting but would not agree to give up territory or pay money. He thought the German army were exhausted, but he was wrong. The Central Powers simply ended the armistice and resumed their invasion, overwhelming the remaining Russian forces, while a German fleet started menacingly up the Baltic towards Petrograd. Both Lenin and Trotsky soon realized that Russia, in its weakened state, would be forced to give in to the enemy's terms. When negotiations resumed later that month, Lenin instructed Trotsky to capitulate on every point, and thus the final treaty was signed on the 3rd of March 1918. Under the treaty, Russia recognized both Finland and Ukraine as independent. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, and most of Belarusia was ceded to Germany and Austria. Kars, Adan, and Batumi in Transcaucasia were handed over to the Ottoman Empire. In all, the treaty forced Russia to give up about 30% of its territory, a third of its population. They lost most of its coal, oil, and iron stores, and much of its industry. Lenin bitterly called the settlement, quote, the abyss of defeat, dismemberment, enslavement, and humiliation, end quote. Despite his profound disappointment, Lenin insisted that his Congress of Soviets to accept the, quote, shameful peace in order to save the world revolution and its only foothold, the Soviet Republic, end quote. Ludendorff had succeeded. Much of his army now stood poised on the Western Front. For Wilhelm, Hindenburg, and Ludendorff, 1917 had brought them time. But at what cost? And would it be enough? Enough to stage one final offensive, or just to postpone the inevitable as the looming threat of American strength drew nearer?